February 28th, 1953. The Kuntsevo Dacha, on the outskirts of Moscow, in the dictator's private residence. Georgian wine flows freely. Joseph Stalin, 74 years old, presides at the head of the table, surrounded by men who fear him more than death itself. Beria, Georgy Malenkov, Nikita Khrushchev, Nikolai Bulganin. The inner circle of Soviet power. They watch a film. They drink. Stalin jokes, in a strangely light mood. He raises his glass, toasts his comrades, and smiles. But that smile carries weight. Between laughs, he distills illusions. Veiled threats. He speaks of purges, of the doctor's plot. A reminder that even here, in this room where loyalty supposedly reigns, no one is safe. The gathering stretches deep into the night. Hours pass. More wine. More films. The tension rises, concealed beneath the appearance of celebration. T4 in the morning. The guests are exhausted. Stalin finally rises and personally escorts each man to the door. A rare gesture that only deepens their unease. The door closes behind them. Inside, Stalin retires to his private apartments. The guards hear nothing. The motion detectors register no movement. The routine is unvarying. He will sleep. Then around 10 or 11 in the morning, he will call for tea. Everything seems normal. But what happens when the man who controls 180 million people loses control of his own body? What happens when the architect of the Great Terror, the instigator of mass executions, the dictator who ruled by fear for nearly 3 decades, becomes the victim of the very system he built? No one ever calls for tea. The silence behind the door is absolute. And in that silence, something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. But inside those walls, the silence was not merely unusual. It was forbidden to acknowledge it that Stalin's dacha operated under a regime of absolute terror, even for those responsible for his protection. Guards like Pyotr Lozgachev lived under strict and merciless orders. Formal prohibition from entering the dictator's quarters without authorization, from disturbing him, from showing concern. Violation of these rules was punishable by death, not a warning. Death. Motion detectors tracked Stalin's movements throughout the residence, a surveillance system designed to monitor without intrusion. On the morning of March 1st, those detectors revealed nothing. No movement, no activity. The usual hour for tea, 10 o'clock, passed without a sound. 11 came and went. Then noon. The guards noticed. They whispered among themselves. But no one moved. This paralysis was not cowardice. It was survival instinct, sharpened under decades of Stalinist rule. The dictator had built a world where even loyalty could be fatal. Where the slightest gesture, the slightest word, the slightest initiative could mean disappearance into the Gulag system or a bullet in a basement. And Stalin's body had been betraying him long before that night. Chronic hypertension, advanced arteriosclerosis, recent dizziness that his doctors had noted but never dared to emphasize. The warning signs were there, but Stalin had made himself untouchable in the most literal sense in his paranoia about the supposed doctor's plot. He had arrested or executed many of the most competent physicians in the country, convinced they were conspiring to poison Soviet leaders. As the afternoon of March 1st gave way to evening, the dacha remained strangely silent. The staff busied themselves with daily tasks, setting the table, preparing meals that would remain untouched. At 6:30 in the evening, a light turned on in Stalin's room. A brief wave of relief passed through the guards that he's awake. He's fine. And then nothing more. No bell, no call, just the light burning in a room that gave no other sign of life. And the growing anguish that something unspeakable was happening behind that locked door. When fear overcomes duty, even a dictator becomes expendable. March 1st, 10:30 p.m. Pyotr Lozgachev could no longer justify the silence. Nearly 18 hours had passed since Stalin had retired to his apartments. No call, no movement. The light was still on, but the room remained silent as a tomb. Lozgachev made a decision that could have cost him his life. He needed a pretext, a plausible reason to enter. He grabbed a stack of mail, official correspondence. Something Stalin might have asked for. It was a thin cover, but it was all he had. He opened the door. The scene inside was grotesque. Joseph Stalin, the man who had commanded armies, reshaped nations, and ordered the execution of millions, lay crumpled on the floor beside a small table. His pajamas were soaked. A puddle of urine spread beneath him. An overturned glass rested near his outstretched hand. A knocked-over bottle of mineral water beside it. Stalin's face was scarlet red. His eyes were open, but absent, vacant, recognizing nothing. His right arm hung along his body, inert and paralyzed. He tried to speak. His mouth moved, but no words came. Only guttural, incoherent sounds escaped his lips, but a massive cerebrovascular stroke had ravaged the left hemisphere of his brain, destroying motor function, speech, and consciousness. Lozgachev called for help. Guards rushed in. They lifted Stalin's limp body and carried it to the sofa in the dining room. They covered him with blankets, slightly repositioned his head, then stood frozen. In 01 called the doctors that Stalin's orders were clear. Do not disturb me. Do not call for reinforcements without authorization. And now, even in agony, those orders remained in force. The guards feared that if Stalin regained consciousness and learned of their excessive initiative, he would have them shot. Better to wait. Better to do nothing. Around midnight, they finally contacted the Politburo. Lavreny Beria and Georgy Malenkov arrived shortly after 1 in the morning. Around midnight, they finally contacted the Politburo. Lavreny Beria and Georgy Malenkov arrived shortly after 1 in the morning. The same men who had been drinking and laughing with Stalin just hours before, they entered the room. They observed the paralyzed dictator. They assessed the situation with glacial pragmatism. Beria leaned over Stalin. Examined him briefly. Straightened up. He's sleeping, Beria announced. Comrade Stalin is sleeping deeply. Do not disturb him further. Both men left, and doctor was called. No emergency protocol was activated. They simply ordered the dying man to be left alone. And that is what was done. When medicine finally arrived, it was no longer fighting stroke. It was fighting a system. Doctors were summoned only on March 2nd at 7 in the morning, more than 30 hours after Stalin's collapse. When they finally arrived at Kuntsevo, they discovered a medical catastrophe, aggravated by bureaucratic terror. The diagnosis was immediate and terrible. Hemorrhagic cerebrovascular accident in the territory of the left middle cerebral artery. Blood pressure at 190/110, dangerously elevated and continuing to rise. Right hemiplegia, complete paralysis of the right arm and leg. Altered consciousness, labored breathing. Stalin was dying, and the lesions were already irreversible. The medical team struggled to apply what treatments were available. Leeches were applied to his neck and face, an archaic method intended to lower the hypertension that had now reached 210/120. Oxygen was administered. Camphor and adrenaline were injected in a desperate attempt to stabilize his cardiovascular system. But Stalin remained unconscious, incontinent, his body releasing its grip piece by piece. On March 2nd, Pravda published the first public medical bulletin, announcing to the Soviet Union and the entire world that their leader had suffered a serious stroke. More bulletins followed on the 3rd and 4th, each more alarming than the last. The country held its breath. Inside the dacha, family members were permitted brief visits. Svetlana, Stalin's daughter, entered the room and saw her father reduced to a shell, altered, paralyzed. Meanwhile, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, Molotov circled like wolves, visiting daily, but already preparing the succession. Power was slipping from Stalin even as his heart still beat. March 4th. The symptoms worsened horribly. Uncontrollable hiccups shook him violently. Profuse sweating soaked the sheets. Then came the hematemesis, vomiting of blood, a sign of gastric hemorrhage secondary to the systemic failure caused by the stroke. Doctors monitored the dictator day and night under military supervision, under strict orders to follow protocol exactly. The cruel irony was undeniable. Stalin had purged the most competent physicians in the Soviet Union during the paranoia of the doctor's plot, convinced they were assassins. Now a terrified second-rate medical team stood powerless before the consequences of his own cruelty. Stalin did not die only from stroke. He died from the fear he himself had created, a fear that delayed care, that paralyzed decision-making, that transformed a medical emergency into a 30-hour death sentence. March 5th, 1953, 9:50 p.m., the man who had controlled everything, lost everything. Stalin's cardiovascular system collapsed. His pulse became imperceptible. His breathing became heavy, labored, desperate. Each breath a struggle against the inevitable arrest. The medical team administered more injections, more oxygen, attempted further futile interventions. Nothing worked. At 9:50 p.m., Joseph Stalin died. He was 74 years old, but the moment of death was not peaceful. Svetlana, his daughter, stood at his bedside and witnessed a scene she would never forget. In those final instants, Stalin suddenly opened his eyes. She described that gaze as terrible, filled with rage, with fear, or perhaps with the horrible awareness of what awaited him. Then his left hand, the only limb he could still move, rose slowly. It extended toward the ceiling, reaching for something invisible, or perhaps cursing the void before him. Then his hand fell, his eyes closed, silence. The official autopsy, conducted by 7 physicians, confirmed the cause of death. Cerebral hemorrhage due to chronic hypertension, secondary gastric and intestinal hemorrhage, severe cardiac damage, no trace of poisoning. The following morning, March 6th, Radio Moscow made the announcement. The solemn, measured voice of Yuri Levitan informed the Soviet people that their leader had succumbed to a devastating stroke following several days of suffering. A national period of mourning was declared. Pravda's medical bulletins had been preparing public opinion. But the news of this sudden disappearance sent a shockwave across the entire country. Inside the Kremlin, Khrushchev, Beria, Malenkov, and Molotov moved quickly. Funerals were organized. But more urgently, the struggle for power began. The dictator was dead. The question now was, who would inherit the terror? Stalin's body was prepared for display. His 29-year reign, marked by industrialization, victory in the Second World War, and the deaths of millions in the purges, the famines, and the Gulag, ended not with a grand exit, but with a solitary collapse on the floor of a dacha. The funerals transformed into a spectacle of mourning and propaganda. But behind the scenes, the power vacuum installed itself immediately. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev all began maneuvering before the body was even cold. The final irony was inescapable. Stalin had built a system so terrifying that even in a medical emergency, it paralyzed the very people who might have saved him. The man who trusted no one died because no one dared trust their own judgment. That raised hand at his last breath, whether rage, fear, or defiance, remains engraved in history. An open question, the end of Tyrant. Brutal not through violence, but through abandonment, the silence settled back over the dacha. The urine-stained floor was cleaned, the door closed, and the silence became permanent. This is the story they reduced to a medical bulletin and a national mourning decree. The story that happened behind the locked door that no one dared open for 30 hours. The floor, the urine, the overturned glass, the raised hand reaching for something that was not there. The most powerful man in the world, brought down not by an enemy, not by a coup, not by the millions he had destroyed, but by the system of fear he had so perfectly constructed that it could not even call a doctor in time to save him. That if this story reached you, if you felt the full weight of what it means when absolute power turns on its own creator, then you already understand why the fall of power exists. This channel was built for exactly these stories. The ones that happen behind closed doors and locked rooms. The final hours that official history condenses into 3 lines. The human truth behind the monuments and the mausoleums and the carefully managed mythology. Subscribe to The Fall of Power right now. Leave a like if this story deserved to be told in full. Share it with someone who thinks they know how Stalin died. And activate the notification bell, because the next file is already open, And what it reveals will make you question everything you thought you knew about the men who hold the world in their hands, and what happens when those hands can no longer grip. The archive does not close.